Jack Nicholson was always unpredictable. His explosive performances, wild laughter, and sly gaze had become symbols of Hollywood. But now, he wasn't on the big screen, he was on the front pages. And not as a hero, but as a villain. "This is outrageous," journalists shouted on live broadcasts. How could he keep this hidden for so long? A bombshell article in a major publication had set the media world on fire. Jack Nicholson's secret daughter, 35 years without a father's support. People devoured every word. A small-town upbringing, a modest life, no financial help. Everything painted the picture of a legendary actor who had turned his back on his own child, leaving her to fend for herself. He lived in luxury while she grew up in poverty, outraged commenters wrote. So much for the great Jack Nicholson. The actor said nothing. That was strange. Usually sharp-tongued and always ready for provocation, Nicholson had simply vanished. No statements, no explanations. His agent's phone rang unanswered. His lawyers refused to comment. That only added fuel to the fire. If he's silent, that means it's true, the tabloids concluded. He's not even trying to deny it. The public had already reached its verdict. He became the latest victim of cancel culture. The same people who had worshipped his films yesterday now turned their backs in disgust. But no one stopped to ask, why was he silent? Because the Real story was far more complicated than a sensational newspaper headline. Somewhere between Chicago and a forgettable little town in Iowa stood an old library. Not a grand museum, not a historic landmark, just a simple brick building with wooden doors that creaked when they opened. No modern computers, no expensive art books, but always filled with quiet. It was the library where she worked, Sarah Blake. When reporters found her, they expected to meet a woman consumed by anger, someone who had spent decades suffering from a father's neglect. They wanted tears, outrage, bitter accusations aimed at Jack Nicholson. But she only smiled, closing the book she had been reading to a group of children, and said calmly, "You probably have a lot of questions." She looked younger than her 35 years, with large brown eyes and little makeup. Her hands weren't used to manicures or diamond rings, but to books, to the small hands of children she guided through fairy tales, to old papers she carefully sorted in the archives. The journalists didn't understand. Where was the drama? Where was the rage? They started throwing provocative questions, hoping to ignite her resentment. When did you find out Jack Nicholson was your father? It's known that he never supported you financially. How do you feel about that? Do you want him to finally acknowledge you publicly? Sarah looked at them steadily, then took a sip of cold coffee from a worn paper cup and said, "Are you here for the truth, or just a good story?" The journalists, of course, wanted a good story. But the truth was far more complicated. She was 12 when her mother told her. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no grand confessions. They were simply sitting on the porch of their small house, Sarah absent-mindedly playing with an old bracelet her mother had always worn. "See this engraving?" Her mother pointed to tiny, faded letters inside the metal band. Sarah squinted. "D and something else. It's worn off." Those were his initials. Whose? Her mother didn't answer right away. She exhaled, as if debating whether she should say it at all. "His name was Jack." "And what about him?" "He's your father." 12-year-old Sarah didn't fully understand at the time. She knew she didn't have a father. No one ever stopped by their house on Christmas with presents, no one taught her how to ride a bike. But she didn't care. Her life was full of books, her mother's warmth, and the old library where she could spend entire days. And yet, the name Jack didn't mean much to her. It was the last name that changed everything. Nicholson. She didn't believe it at first. "Jack Nicholson?" she asked. "Yes." "The one from The Shining?" Her mother smiled. "That's him." Sarah didn't know how to react. It sounded insane. He was a legend. A great actor, someone the whole world knew and admired. And now her mother was saying he was her father? "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you wouldn't have understood before. And now I do. I think now you're ready to decide for yourself." Sarah said nothing. She looked down at the bracelet, at the faded letters, and finally asked, Does he know about me?" Her mother lowered her gaze. "Yes." A few days later, Sarah found an old box in her mother's closet. She opened it and saw dozens of letters. Letters from him. They weren't what she expected from a Hollywood star. No grand words, no theatrics. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I want you to know I haven't forgotten you. You deserve more than just being Jack Nicholson's daughter. I want you to be yourself. I'm not perfect, but I'm here if you need me." He wrote. He didn't call. He didn't visit. But he wrote. He never offered money, never made promises. He just wrote. And she never responded. Back then, she didn't want to. She didn't want to be the illegitimate daughter of someone famous. She didn't want the attention, the pity, the scandal. She just wanted to live her life, without expectations, without noise surrounding her name. But now, with journalists knocking on her door, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. And she knew there was only one person who could answer her questions. Jack Nicholson. For the first time in 35 years, she decided to find him. Jack Nicholson was sitting in his Malibu home, watching the ocean, when his secretary placed an envelope in front of him. She wants to meet. Jack didn't react. Of course, he was a good actor. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, knowing it would come sooner or later. He simply sighed, picked up the envelope, and nodded. Where? Iowa. She doesn't want attention. That didn't surprise him. For nearly half a century, he had lived under the constant eye of the cameras. But this day was different. When he stepped into the small cafe, no one even looked at him. Sarah was sitting by the window. When he approached, she glanced up and simply said, "Hi." "Hi." Jack sat across from her, and silence settled between them. Not awkward, not tense, just silence. "Looks like you're doing well," he said, studying her. She smiled. "Yeah, I have a life. A job I love." He nodded. "I'm glad." She exhaled. "Why did you stay silent when the scandal broke?" Jack traced his fingers along the table. "Because I had nothing to say. People thought you were a bastard. They always have. Comes with the roles I play." Jack smirked slightly. She leaned forward. "But you knew the truth was different." Jack smiled again, that familiar glint in his eyes, the same look audiences had seen on the big screen for decades. "Sarah, does the truth ever really matter?" She held his gaze for a long time. "You never tried to be part of my life." "That's not true." "Then why?" Jack sighed. "Because I didn't want you to be part of mine." She hadn't expected that answer. "I knew that if I acknowledged you publicly, your life would change. You would stop being yourself. People would only ever see you as Nicholson's daughter. That would have been a curse." He leaned back in his chair. "You have no idea what it's like to be part of this machine. I didn't want to drag you into it." She stayed silent. "But you could have just helped?" He smiled. "And then what? People would have found out. The press would have started digging, watching your every move. I didn't want you living under a microscope." She wanted to argue. But then she thought about her childhood. She had lived peacefully. No one had followed her. No one had compared her to her father. "That doesn't mean you had to disappear," she said quietly. Jack nodded. "Yeah, and I regret that." When they stepped out of the cafe, he handed her a folder. "What's this?" "A project. I found out you work with charities. That you help kids." She opened the papers, confused. "This is a foundation. I've already set it up. It's completely yours." She didn't know what to say. "But why?" Jack smiled. "Because I wasn't a good father. But maybe I can still do something good for kids like you kids without fathers." A few weeks later, journalists started noticing something strange. Nicholson never made a public statement, but word got out that he was financing a major project for children in need. Eventually, they uncovered that it was led by Sarah Blake. She refused interviews. And he, as always, stayed silent.